We continue in 2 Samuel 14 as the woman from Tekoa, earlier described as a wise woman and described by herself as a widow woman, now simply, as you can see on the left side of the screen, described as the woman, makes her third attempt to try to get to the king in Joab's words, or are they still Joab's words? So before we enter in our passage, which you can see on the right side of the screen, let's go back and remind ourselves of some of the parallels, both with the immediate stories around us. First, in chapter 12, the aftermath of the Bathsheba story, we can see down here where Nathan accused David and prophesied judgment. This, of course, around the Bathsheba-Uriah situation. And here the woman of Tekoa will accuse David and appeal to his ego. So exactly parallel there. And then we also see the parallels in the immediate preceding chapter 13 with the rape of Tamar here, where Tamar is deceived into offering food to Amnon at the will of Jonadab, and David is deceived into accepting her story as truth at the will of Joab. And both will end with the Absalom aftermath, as we'll see. So in our immediate shape of our story, as I've been noting throughout as I zoom back out, there are no immediate chiasms in this section, although we'll see one next time in this section. Rather, what we see is the repeated emphasis on the king and my lord the king. As I noted last time, nobody uses the phrase my lord the king as much as this woman except Abigail in 1 Kings 25. So now we're on the third attempt, and as I've been noting, we don't know how much she's repeating the words of Joab that he put in her mouth at the beginning that we saw up here, and how much this is her being spontaneous in response to what David the king is saying. We don't know if any of this are the words of Joab because we didn't hear them. So it's part of this entire chapter's mixed knowledge of who knows what about whose intention. As noted at the beginning, we don't even know Joab's intention for sure, because what we heard was the king's heart was either on or against Absalom here, depending upon how the Hebrew preposition all is translated. So it could be that he's trying to reunite the king with Absalom, which will sort of happen at the end, or he's trying to prepare the king for the possibility of Absalom's rebellion and trying to bring the enemy closer to him so he can keep an eye on him, rather than have Absalom being where he is now at his grandfather's house in Geshur, in another field of power where his grandfather and his great-grandfather were local kings. So we don't know what Joab's motive is. We don't know how much the woman is being faithful to that or not. But as she speaks, and many scholars have noted that her speech is disjunctive in a number of ways and isn't clear to understand. That's true in the Hebrew as well. Sometimes translators attribute that to a bad transmission of the text. But as Robert Alter will note on what we hear today, she can speak eloquently, as we see in verse 14 here, but when she returns to the subject, her speech is more jumbled and less clear. So it's almost certainly not just a transmission error, but an expression of the characterization of her in the face of the king. And perhaps she's afraid of the king, understandably, because he's the king and she's nobody. We don't even know her name. So let's look a little more closely, and we'll enter into our passage here, starting down here. So to note what's been happening, she told this story like Cain and Abel, and of course it's not an echo. I shouldn't say of course, because you might not have been following all that, but as I've been noting throughout this unit of 2 Samuel 13 and 14, there are many echoes of Genesis, but Genesis is almost certainly a later text than this, from the time of exile. So the Cain and Abel story is a response to this story. This is not meant to be an echo of the Cain and Abel story. And I'm even going to make a supplementary video on my Genesis series to highlight what I've learned working on this series to put back in there. So you might look for that if you'd like. But in the first attempt, she told this story, and the king deferred. He said, I'll figure it out later. Basically, I'll rule concerning you at some future date. But then she continued, and she offered to put the guilt on her and make the king's house guiltless. We're not sure what guilt would be involved at this point, given that what she's asking is to resolve the situation of the clan vengeance versus her having any inheritance as a widow if her second and last son is killed. So he was in a difficult situation and didn't know what to do, but when she says that, he gives another option here, which is still not to the point, saying, if someone says anything to you, bring him to me and he shall never touch you again. But no one has touched her as far as she said. What she's concerned about is not her own physical safety, but the safety of her son who has killed his brother. So she tried again, we see here, and then he finally says, as Yahweh lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. And as I noted last time, an irony given how Absalom dies in chapter 18 with his long hair caught in a tree, and then he's suspended, as the text says, between heaven and earth. So with this, she is now getting to the point, at least Joab's point, and that's where we begin now, when she, like Nathan, convicts the king and highlights that what she's been saying is fictional to try to trap him. So let's look at that here, starting in verse 12. So the woman said, "Please let your servant speak a word to my lord the king." And of course, as usual, speaking of herself in the third person. And he said, "Speak," as if she hasn't been speaking a word all along. So then she continues here. And as my note from Alter has below, highlighting what I was just suggesting, rather than reflecting difficulties in textual transmission, her language probably expresses her sense of awkwardness in virtually indicting the king. So let's listen to the New RSV here, and then we'll listen to Fackelman's suggested alternative translation below. The woman said, "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again." So before we look at the translation comparison, just a note here. What thing? All he's said, if we scroll back up, or if you look on the right side of the screen, he simply said, "Not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." He hasn't planned anything within the context of their immediate conversation. So plainly, she's referring outside the context of their immediate conversation. But what is the thing that he's planned here, or literally what he's thought? And we'll look again at the translation in a minute. And then her second sentence is equally confusing. It doesn't fit either the little story she told or the situation of Absalom exactly. So we'll have to look back at that in a minute. Let's look at Fackelman's translation that you can see down below here. He suggests, using King James-like language, "Why hast thou then undertaken such against God's people? Yes, because the king has uttered this, he is guilty for not taking back the cast-off one. Verily, we must certainly die, yes, as water oozing away into the soil, which can no more be gathered up. But would God make no effort or take no initiative to let the cast-out one not remain cast out from him?" That's a mistake. There should be cast out. And of course, that's translating both these two verses, not just the one. And Fackelman comments, "The woman has almost changed unrecognizably. The eloquence of the courtly style has vanished, apart from the bare minimum of Hamelech in verse 13 CD here, banished one. She has thus decided to grab the bull by the horns." Others have suggested otherwise. Graham Auld offers this: "And why have you reckoned like this about the people of God, or Yahweh, and from the king's disregarding this word, or from the king saying this word, exercising self-control, as guilty, the king's not bringing back his outcast? For your son is dead, die we must, and like the waters that are poured on the ground, which will not be gathered, so he cannot take back his life again, and God will not raise a life, and the king has reckoned reckonings, nor will reckon reckonings, to cast out from him an outcast, not to cast out from him an outcast." And that's awfully confusing, and that's what Alter's point is. That this is confusing, both in terms of just the language of it, and it's confusing in relation to the narrative context, and it's confusing in relation to the larger context of why Joab has sent her. So we need to look at some detail there to figure out what's going on. So why then have you planned such a thing? And although the word planned here is literally to think, it does match what we see here as plans in the next verse. So she's suggesting that he as king has planned something against the people of God, but God has different kinds of plans. So it's contrasting literally the thoughts of David with the thoughts of the king. So literally we could hear this: "Why have you thought such a thing or conceived such a thing?" Which is what I have here on the right side, against the people of God. But he has to be wondering, what thing is it? The only thing it could be is that Joab knows what's really going on, which could be one of a couple of things. That David is trying to keep Absalom at a distance, which renders the succession unstable and perhaps can be seen as rendering the monarchy unstable. Or even more so, as I've been suggesting throughout these couple of chapters, that David is hoping that Absalom can get himself killed in a war and is encouraging this hostility and rebellion so that Solomon can get on the throne without it looking like David has caused the death of his own son. And perhaps that's what Joab is suggesting through the woman that David is thinking of here, of how to get Absalom killed. Because after all, the previous time we had a scene like this, when Nathan was confronting David, it was over getting Uriah killed. Uriah, who is a totally innocent person, a member of David's leading military, as indicated by the fact that he lived right next door to the king's own house, and yet David was perfectly willing to have him killed to cover over his dalliance with Bathsheba. So why not more have somebody else killed to get his and Bathsheba's child on the throne? We don't know that. maybe Joab knows that, but we don't know whether Joab knows that, and David's playing his cards close to the vest throughout. So that's just a possibility, but what other thing might it be? We don't know. So she continues, for in giving this decision, the decision that not one of your son's hair shall fall to the ground, literally in speaking this word, the king guilts himself. The word here convicts here, Hashem, Ka'ashem here, is only 2 other times in the whole Hebrew scripture, but it does mean guilt. It's not the most obvious word for it, but it does mean that, to be convicted or to be found guilty. Inasmuch as the king does not bring, translated here as banished one home again, and banished is a bad translation here for nautic here, because it's not true to the word and it's not true to the context. Absalom was not banished. David didn't send him away. Absalom fled after he killed Amnon, and the rest of the king's sons returned to Jerusalem from Baal Hazor, where the sheep shearing ceremony was, that was the cover for the murder of Amnon. So Absalom was not banished. He's exiled. He's moved away. And that's the first explicit reference here, although it's not as explicit. It's not referencing Absalom. But it has nothing to do with the little story of the 2 sons that she was telling. So now she pauses to wax philosophic. As Alter notes again, moving beyond Absalom to a wise woman's pronouncement on human fate, she breaks free of her verbal stumbling and becomes eloquent. As the wise woman switches back from philosophic statement to the juridical issue confronting David, her language again becomes knotty and oblique. And as I noted below the translation of this, we also saw from Ald and from Fackelman. So, we must all die. Well, no news there, doubled in the Hebrew, because we die, like water spilled on the ground, and paired with the image we saw earlier of the quenched ember, that if her second son was killed, that would be the put out the ember of her life. She would have no man to support her. So we're all like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up. That parenthetically notes something at least about her or Joab's, or if you want to extrapolate, the author's or the audience's understanding of what happens when we die. There's certainly nothing in the Hebrew scripture about a soul or going to heaven or hell when you die. That's not even a biblical notion in the New Testament. That comes from the church fathers, but that's a totally different topic. But certainly the understanding here is that when you die, and you just go back into the ground like we hear here, and like we hear in Genesis 3 as well. But God will not take away a life. As my note below, this sentence recalls the first fratricide and God's judgment on Cain, or it doesn't recall it, and anticipates it from the authors of Genesis here. So notice the contrast here, that you will convict yourself, but God will not take a life. Literally a nephesh here, highlighting how God made people in Genesis 2. So many echoes of the early stories in Genesis. He will devise plans, or literally, he will think thoughts. So in contrast to the thoughts you're thinking, God's thoughts will not take a life, but will not keep an outcast banished. And there's no word for outcast here, so let's look at the translation here. Literally, so not to push away a banished one, or not to push away an exiled one. And how ironic is that given Genesis 4:16, the aftermath of Cain and Abel? Let's look at that there. Notice the will not keep someone out from your presence, and here Cain went away from the presence of Yahweh and settled in the land of Nod. Notice that Yahweh didn't do that. Cain did that. Yahweh urged Cain to master sin and did not send Cain away, but that was Cain's choice. So Yahweh could not force Cain back, and Yahweh will not force Absalom back. Can David force Absalom back? Can Joab force Absalom back? Well, we'll find out that soon, but not quite yet. So, having offered this philosophical statement and a theological statement about God, now she returns to the topic. But when she returns to the topic, it's even more confusing. So let's hear how she does that. Now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Well, which people? The story she told was that the Mishpah, the clan, was sending a Goel, a redeemer of blood, to kill her son. So there's one person, and she will say that in the very next verse, deliver his servant, which is her, of course, from the hand of the man. So there she's concerned about one man, but earlier here in verse 15, she seems to think the people are afraid. Maybe it's the whole Mishpah that are upset about the fratricide, but we don't know that, and she hasn't said anything about that sooner. So your servant thought, and And now they're all thinking. So we hear about David's thinking, making a plan, and Yahweh's thinking, and now she's thinking, I will speak to the king. It may be the king will perform the request or make the word. But this is something you might hear at the very beginning. And that this is explaining why she's come at all, but she saves this for near the end rather than saying this at the beginning. It doesn't quite make a chiasm out of her speech, because in her speech, as we can see right here, she started immediately simply saying she was a widow woman and telling the story of the two sons, the fictional story, of course. But now she returns to her hope from the beginning without adding any detail and seeming to maintain the fiction about the two sons, even though here in verse 14 she was already sliding toward, taking the veil off and making it clear that she was talking about Absalom. So she continues here in verse 16, and I recognize my note below. We can hear this at a number of levels. As I was noting at the beginning, we can hear the two sons as an allegory about Israel and Judah, much like the story of the two prostitutes and the two sons in 1 Kings 3 is a story about Israel and Judah, as we'll explain when we get to those passages. So if we want to hear it that way, in this case, the king is Yahweh, who will hear the prayer and save the exiles from Babylon, at least in the mind of the author here, but that's of course not what happens. And as Jeremiah explains that, you relied on Egypt, so let Egypt save you. If they'd relied on Yahweh, perhaps Yahweh would have saved them if they relied on their partnership with Egypt. And that's for way later in 2 Kings. But we can also hear it at a different level. We can hear this at another level as the connection between the house of David and the house of Saul. Let me show how that is. Let's look at the verse and it'll show how that is. For the king will hear and deliver or save or rescue, echoing what the request was back in verse 6. No rescuer back here. From the hand of the man who had cut both me and my son off from the heritage of God. We'll look more closely at the heritage of God in just a second. But what if we read this as the Saulites versus the Davidites here, that the hand of the man who had cut me off, what if this voice is the voice of the house of Saul, and the hand of the man who had cut me off is David, cut me off and my son, Ishbosheth, who was killed earlier, but there's more to it than that. Because if we look at the phrase, the heritage, and not Nahalat, we see something very interesting. So let's look at it here in Samuel and Kings. So we heard back in 1 Samuel 10, Samuel said to Saul, now this shall be the sign to you that Yahweh has anointed you ruler over his heritage. It's not clear what heritage means there. Is that the people? Is it the land? Is it some bounded amount of authority? It's not clear yet. Way later in 1 Samuel, we hear David say to Saul, as he's trying to persuade Saul to stop chasing him down to kill him, if it is Yahweh who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is mortals, may they be cursed before Yahweh, for they have driven me out today from my share in the heritage of Yahweh. Again, is that his share of the monarchy? Is it his share of the land? It's not clear there. So we have it in our immediate scene that we just looked at. But then later in 2 Samuel was another wise woman I've noted before in a passage that bears all kinds of connections with our passage in the Genesis passage because she's from a town named Abel, which certainly fits into the Genesis 4 story. And this is speaking to Joab about someone who's of the house of Saul, who's threatening the kingdom of David and is in the city that she's in, leaning down from the wall and talking to Joab. She says, I am one of those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. You seek to destroy a city that is a mother in Israel. Why will you swallow up the heritage of Yahweh? So is the heritage of Yahweh there the city that is a mother in Israel, which is to suggest a city that has suburbs and has daughter cities as they're referred to? And again, this is another wise woman, and close to the woman in Genesis 3 who ate the fruit, which she saw, at least perceived, could make her a wise woman as well. So a number of those connections. Then we'll see the chapter after that, in 2 Samuel 21:3, David said to the Gibeonites, who were coming to him at that point, looking to see whether they can be part of Israel or not, what shall I do for you? How shall I make expiation that you may bless the heritage of God? And what that will involve is their demand for the grandchildren of Saul to be killed. So that they could be free of that. And so there's another echo of Saul there that makes it seem like perhaps the one who had cut off is certainly echoing the struggle between David and Saul, which could also be seen as the story between Israel and Judah, with Saul, the house of Saul is what ruled over Israel before David came along, and David is the sole ruler of Judah. And we'll see that same kind of split when the monarchy splits after Solomon, when Rehoboam doesn't understand how to hold it together, and the people of Israel say, to your tents, and they have nothing more to do with the son of Jesse. So we'll see that happen there. But it's not based on Saul there. It's based on Israel versus Judah. Then we'll see in 1 Kings, and when Solomon's giving his speech about the dedication of the temple, and I won't read the whole thing here, but calling that Yahweh has separated them from among the peoples of the earth to be your heritage, highlighting the role of them being separate, very different than Genesis, where all people are in the divine image. So this fits what I call the religion of empire, where Israel is said to be separate and presumably superior to, not just apart from, just as you promised through Moses your servant, which would echo the Deuteronomic issue there, and this is almost certainly a later piece added there from the same sort of Deuteronomic editing as we see in the time of Josiah in 2 Kings 22 and 23 that brought us one version of Deuteronomy in the book of Joshua, and I've noted that a number of times in here. A little later, though, speaking of Rehoboam, this is the moment we see. So when all Israel saw the king Rehoboam would not listen to them, the people answered the king, "What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse to your tents, O Israel." Notice that this doesn't say Yahweh's inheritance, specifically the inheritance of the son of Jesse. And here it certainly sounds like they're breaking off from the succession of the monarchy in Jerusalem, and that's what they do. Then a little later, Naboth, the landowner, saying to Ahab, "Yahweh forbid that I should give you my ancestral inheritance." So the king who wants that and will be challenged by Elijah for doing that, here speaking of it as his land, but is it ancestral inheritance as divided according to what we might hear in Joshua, as given by Yahweh? We don't know from there. And then finally, near the very end of 2 Kings, the end of the monarchy story, we hear Yahweh said generically here by his servants the prophets, no specific prophet named, "I will cast off the remnant of my heritage and give them into the hand of their enemies, and they shall become a prey and a spoil to all their enemies," clearly indicating the exile. So there are exilic elements all around here, whether it's exile from Jerusalem, from the Saulite people who leave, the people of Israel, or here the exiles altogether, or whether it's simply Absalom. The heritage of Yahweh or of God as Elohim here plays throughout. So how do we relate that back to this? What would this text here be suggesting is being cut off? Can we hear this as the succession, as being cut off from access to the monarchy, that whether we see this son as Absalom or whether we see this son as the sons of Saul, it's certainly addressing at one level the monarchy. But why? As again, it's confused speech here, and many scholars have grappled with it and not been able to unravel it completely. So let's look finally at verse 17 here, the end of her speech. And this is where, as I've noting here, there's a little chiasm that we can see in this section here, and it fits nicely there, and we'll look at the beginning of it today and finish it in the next video. So your servant thought, the word of my lord the king will set me at rest. Notice the second time we're hearing what she thought. We heard her thoughts up here. Will set me at rest. The phrase here, lemenucha, only here in Samuel. It's only a couple other times in the Hebrew scripture. Omitting a na, please. Will please set me at rest. Again, that's the only word, the same word there, only here in Samuel. For my lord the king is like the angel of God. And we've seen nothing like this before. We only see this in 1 Samuel 29:9 here. Achish replied, the Philistine king, I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. And we noted then, what would a Philistine know about an angel of God? Or does he mean messenger of God? Because the Hebrew malach means both angel and messenger. An angel basically is the Greek version of the Hebrew, angelos, meaning messenger, before it became the English word angel. So what do we think an angel of God is like? There have not been angels within the books of Samuel, so we don't know what the presuppositions are about an angel of God. But here's the answer. Hearing good and evil. Notice not knowing good and evil, like in Genesis 2:9, 17, 3:5 that we see there, or in 1 Kings 3:9, a little bit different. This is hearing good and evil, suggesting that he can hear and sort through the difference, hence discerning. And she ends with, Yahweh your God be with you, which is only one other time in the entire Hebrew scripture. So she ends with this sort of benediction that perhaps is flattering, or perhaps putting a sense of trust, at least verbally. We'll see. But what is the king going to do with this convoluted speech that he's just heard, that has a little to do with Absalom, not much to do with the story of the two sons, and is not asking for anything in particular, since he's already said that not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground? We'll hear next time how the king grapples with this confusing word. See you then for that. Bye-bye.